Hi, I'm Phil Anderson, and I'm running for United States Senate to represent Wisconsin. Recently, you may have noticed that I've been using some pre-recorded videos for my daily videos, some things I recorded earlier in the week and even a couple from last summer. That's because I was laid up with a sore knee. Turns out I've got a torn meniscus. But actually, this started a few months ago where I had a sore knee, and instead of going to the doctor, I just limped around thinking that it would go away. But the unintended consequence of that was that my hip got out of whack a little bit too, so now not only do I have a torn meniscus, but I've got a sore hip and a sore ankle. And that made me think about an economist, an Austrian economist named Friedrich von Hayek. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he talked a lot about unintended consequences as they relate to government programs and interventions in the economy. So he said that the criteria for whether the government should do something or not, and he was generally against that, but if the government were going to do something at all, you should not only look at what the program was intended to do, but what its likely or even unlikely unintended consequences were. So I think back to when the federal government in the early 20th century decided that they wanted to change the balance of wildlife on the Kaibab Plateau in southwestern United States, where they decided to get rid of the wolves so that the deer and antelope and such could prosper. And what happened was the deer and antelope started starving to death because they were overpopulating, and they had to reintroduce the wolves. So that was an unintended consequence of that policy. Also, I wonder if when Woodrow Wilson gave in to the bankers and allowed the Federal Reserve Bank to be formed in 1913, basically giving over control of our money supply to private bankers, if he realized that that would change monetary policy over the course of the next 100 years such that the dollar is worth only about 4% of what it was worth 100 years ago. That's right. A dollar is worth, its buying power is only worth about 4% of what it was 100 years ago because the Federal Reserve prints money, and it sounds like a good idea to redistribute money across the banking system and people, but the unintended consequence of that, or maybe the intended consequence in this case, is that the money becomes worth less and less, has less and less buying power. Further, I wonder if the federal government, specifically President FDR, before World War II, anticipated that by having a very strong, strict blockade around Japan in 1940 and 41 would result in them becoming so desperate that they would undertake a very dangerous mission, and that is to bomb Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. An unintended consequence of that economic policy, strangling Japan, making them desperate to attack us. And looking farther, a little bit later in the century, I wonder if when we invaded Iraq in 1991, and then again in 2003, and then after that Afghanistan, if we realized that that invasion, under false pretenses, as we find out now, would result in the radicalization of people to become members of Al-Qaeda and become terrorists, that we would create a situation basically by prosecuting this so-called war on terror that drove people into the arms of our enemies, that gave people legitimate reasons. We had attacked their homeland, we had killed their families. We still, to this day, have drone strikes in various parts of the world that tend to radicalize people and make them hate us. And why wouldn't they? That's perfectly reasonable. But was that an intended or unintended consequence of that foreign policy? And now let's look to last week. Huge $1.1 trillion budget deal passed called the Omnibus. Why was it called the Omnibus? Because there's a whole bunch of different things packed in there besides the budget. Not only is there $500 billion more debt, which by putting that in the budget, we've got money to spend on various programs, but what will be the long-term consequences, unintended, of that debt? Furthermore, what are the unintended consequences of continuing to fund Planned Parenthood? It seems to me that those should be pretty easy to decipher. How about subsidies for solar companies and wind companies? You think that you're helping those out, but really you're also disadvantaging other people. Anytime the government does something to help somebody, supposedly, to help somebody, not only do they tend to take control of that segment that they're trying to help, but they disadvantage every other segment. They throw the competitive balance completely out of whack. And what about the provision in the Omnibus bill that's taken from the original CISA, the CISA provision, which allows internet and cell phone companies to not be held liable as much for sharing data, supposedly private data, with the government? Now, Senator Ron Johnson will tell you publicly in his press release that that's about keeping America safe. But what are the unintended consequences of that? How much information does the government have about us? How many different ways can they use it to invade our privacy? We've already seen that the IRS has abused that privilege the privilege of information, in order to work against nonprofits that were Tea Party groups. Just as easily, in another administration, that can be used against progressive groups. Why should the government have all this data? Ostensibly is to keep us free, but that's not worked in the past, and the unintended consequence of that is erosion of our liberties. If we look back to the Declaration of Independence, there are some very basic things that we have rights to that belong to us as people, as persons. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, property. If we respect those, when we look towards what government should and shouldn't do, we should be able to avoid a lot of these unintended consequences. But as long as we fail to learn the lessons of history, the lessons that are right before us, from 100 years ago, from 200 years ago, from Roman times, all the way up to the present, to just last week. If we fail to follow those lessons, then we will continue to fail. We will continue to fail having a decent government, one that respects our liberties. I ask you for your vote, and I ask you to look closely at the people that represent you and see if they're just pandering to you or if they're actually looking at the intended consequences and unintended consequences of the programs that they support. Thanks. I'll talk to you tomorrow.